On the night of November 29th, 1992, Atlanta was the scene of a terrible crime. Sarah Tokers was returning home from Florida, where she had spent Thanksgiving with her family. Her two young sons, Ricky, age 6, and Mike, age 4, were sleeping in the back seat of the car. When she parked in front of her house and got out to open the door, Sarah was ambushed. A man emerged from the darkness, attacked her, and forced her back into the vehicle. While she drove under threat, she pleaded for her children's lives. Within minutes, Sarah was shot. The car stopped in front of a church, with the children inside, witnesses and victims of the tragedy. At first, everything pointed to a violent and senseless attack, a completely random crime. However, investigators would soon uncover a hidden plot behind what happened. And the big question then was, who was really interested in Sarah Tokar's death? Before we can really talk about the Tokar's family and why all of this happened, first we have to talk about Sarah. She was born on June 28, 1953, in a small town in New York State called Amherst, where she grew up in a very large family made up of her parents and 7 sisters. Despite having such a big family, the truth is that thanks to her parents' hard work, Sarah and her sisters grew up in a home where they never lacked a thing. On the contrary, the girls were raised with several luxuries, enjoying a childhood and adolescence that was as normal and happy as could be. It was actually during her teenage years that she met Fred Tokars in high school, who, just like her, was the child of a doctor. Although they were very good classmates during that time in their lives, they didn't have a close relationship. They weren't friends, just classmates, so their lives went their separate ways, and they wouldn't cross paths again until many years later. Described as a very friendly person, full of life and passionate about fashion, after finishing high school, Sarah decided to become a physical education teacher, going on to teach at different schools and high schools throughout the 1980s. By her late 20s, Sarah stood out for her beauty and captivating personality. She loved going out at night and generally enjoyed her single life a lot, but she had started to dream about starting a family, like her sisters had. After a complicated breakup, the young woman decided to leave New York. By that time, her parents, who were retired, had settled in Florida, where one of her sisters also lived, so she thought it was a good idea to move to Atlanta, a city 9 hours away from where her parents and sister lived. In that city, Sarah got a job as a promoter for Illand, one of the most popular nightclubs at the time. It was thanks to that job that in 1981 she met the man who would become her first husband. He was the wealthy owner of a social club in the north of Atlanta, where Sarah started working as an aerobics instructor after they got married. Even though their marriage seemed solid, after a short time together, her husband's infidelities became obvious, leading the couple to separate, and Sarah went back to working in nightclubs and moved in with her sister Chrissy. That's how, one day while watching TV, she saw a familiar face. It was Frederick Tokars, or Fred, her former classmate, who was giving statements as the assistant district attorney about the trial of a case he had been working on. Although she and Fred were never close, the nostalgia of seeing an old classmate from Amherst in Atlanta made her look up his phone number and call him. Fred had gone to the University of Miami to study notary work, which he did for a few years before returning to college to graduate as a lawyer, a profession he had been practicing for some years, earning a spot at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. There, he showed an interest in working on white-collar or electronic fraud cases, since, according to him, he was an expert in those areas. Described by his co-workers as a man with an insatiable desire to be involved in the cases that interested him, Fred was an ambitious person who loved going out at night and making up stories about the supposed cases he had worked on. Stories that, after that call from Sarah, he would go on to tell her and her sister. They started to think of Fred as a man of great morals who made sure to put the bad guys behind bars. However, the truth is that Fred didn't have such high moral values. The lawyer had no problem admitting that he wanted to go back to being an accountant, specifically for well-off clients. However, to make this aspiration a reality, he lacked the necessary connections. As the relationship became more serious, Sarah was convinced she had found a man with good values, similar to her own, someone with whom she could finally start a family. Whereas in reality, Fred saw her as a way to fulfill his dream. Thanks to her first marriage and her job, Sarah knew some of the most important people in the city. That was reason enough for the lawyer to continue the relationship and even propose to his former high school classmate. The couple got married on July 26, 1985. And even though it seemed like Sarah had finally achieved her dream, marrying a good man, having a beautiful house, and a future family, her parents and sisters started to notice some warning signs in the marriage. Even though they were newlyweds, Fred never had dinner with Sarah. He told her he had to work late. Even though the time he spent with her was very little, Sarah seemed genuinely happy. Her happiness grew even more when, after a few months, she found out she was pregnant with their first child. Together with Fred, Sarah bought a house in Kings Cove, a private area of Atlanta, where they welcomed their firstborn, Ricky, in September 1996. Although Sarah had worked practically up until the last moment of her pregnancy, after her son was born, she started wanting to quit her job. She wanted to stay home with Ricky and be the one to take care of him. So she told her husband about this wish, but he was completely against it, accusing her of being lazy for wanting to quit her job. Even though she really didn't like her husband's insults or the way he said it, Sarah didn't want to go through a second divorce, especially not when her son had just been born. So, appealing to her peaceful nature, she looked for a way to keep her job while also spending more time with her son. She cut her work days and hours in half, even though that meant bringing work home almost every day. It was around that time that Fred quit his job as an assistant at the district attorney's office and started working privately as a lawyer, beginning with basic cases like drug possession charges or selling substances on Atlanta's nightlife scene. Using his work as an excuse, Fred left Sarah alone every night, going out to clubs and bars until the early morning, only coming back the next day. When Sarah tried to tell him that these habits weren't bringing any money into the family, her husband would promise that soon it would start paying off. But the truth was that the couple's financial situation was getting more complicated every day. And because of this, Fred became extremely controlling, with the only steady money coming into the house. Sarah's salary, which she was paid in checks. Fred forced his wife to give him those checks, giving her back only a small portion of the money so she could pay the household bills, including medical expenses, groceries, and everything else. Even though the money her husband gave back to her wasn't enough to cover everything he expected, Sarah juggled things to make sure Ricky and the house never went without. But the situation didn't last long. Just a few months later, after that, Sarah lost her job. It turns out that Atlanta's nightlife had gone into a recession due to things like strict laws against alcohol consumption, and hundreds of workers like Sarah ended up losing their jobs. In fact, Sarah ended up becoming a full-time housewife, while her husband started working as a defense attorney in tax evasion and divorce cases. In 1988, Sarah gave birth to her second child, Michael, and although the family's financial situation by then seemed to have improved at least a little, Fred continued to be extremely controlling with the money and the way his wife spent it. By that point, he had forbidden her from paying for her purchases or bills in any way other than cash, as a way to evade the IRS, the United States Internal Revenue Service. He didn't want them to be able to audit their expenses and income, except for what they reported on their annual tax returns. As if the constant control wasn't enough, a few years after Mike was born, Fred made a will in which, in the event of his death, he left his brother in charge of managing and controlling his estate until his children came of age, which clearly upset Sarah a great deal. On top of that, there was also the fact that Fred no longer seemed to be chasing criminals, but defending them. For Sarah, a woman who was convinced of her values, the fact that her husband had dozens of criminals among his clients started to worry her, especially because of the way Fred interacted with them. Sarah knew that her husband's clients often followed the same rules he imposed on her. That is, they paid for his services in cash, so the money couldn't be traced. So she was convinced it was dirty money coming from drug trafficking. It was a concern she often shared with her sister Chrissy. All those factors led Sarah to start thinking about divorce again, especially because the situation kept getting worse. By 1992, Fred wouldn't allow her to have bank accounts in her name, let alone credit cards. He wouldn't let her have any money of her own. She absolutely had to ask her husband for money, and he expected her to get by on $400 a month. As time went by, Fred started distancing her from her family, making up excuses so she wouldn't go visit them. And if those excuses didn't work, he'd do things like refuse to give her money for gas or lend her the car so she could travel to Florida. The few times he agreed to visit Sarah's family, he forced her and their children to drive while he traveled by plane. More and more convinced that she wanted a divorce, Sarah started the process to separate from her husband. She knew that legally Fred didn't have much purchasing power or assets, but her years of marriage had shown her that the lawyer had his ways of getting around the authorities. Unwilling to let the divorce end with her left without all the money her husband had, she decided to hire a private investigator. Since she didn't have any money of her own, the woman paid part of his fee with a pearl necklace, promising to pay the rest when she had the cash. The private investigator took the necklace, but didn't really work seriously on the case. He thought Sarah's concerns were exaggerated. He thought she just wanted to win the divorce and the custody battle that would follow, so he simply didn't investigate Fred. Overwhelmed by the lack of answers, Sarah decided to take a risk and go into her husband's office, which was in the basement of the house, where she discovered a series of financial documents showing that Fred was creating offshore accounts, that is, bank accounts in other countries, to funnel money from criminal activities into the financial system. In other words, he was in charge of laundering money for his criminal clients, who used that cash to fund clubs in Atlanta, where they would then sell illegal substances. Among the names listed in the documents was Eddie Charles Lawrence, a local drug dealer who dreamed of becoming a major figure in drug trafficking. But in reality, his operation was small scale and not even enough to make a living. In fact, Eddie had to work off and on as a construction worker because he couldn't make ends meet. But for Fred, this was an opportunity. After meeting him at a nightclub, he made sure to talk to him several times until he convinced him to launder his money through him. But that wasn't the only way he manipulated him. Soon, he convinced him to commit another crime, to murder Sarah. He started to suspect that his wife was gathering information for the divorce and to expose his illegal activities. Refusing to declare his true assets and give her half his money, the lawyer began to plan how to get rid of his wife. He soon involved Eddie in the plan, stressing that he too would be harmed if the truth came out. That's how he made him part of his plan. He wanted to murder Sarah and make it look like an accident. The idea was for Eddie to break into the family home and kill his wife, making sure it looked like a robbery gone wrong. Eddie flatly refused. He was a criminal, but not a killer, so he wasn't going to kill Sarah. But he couldn't deny that Fred was right. So instead of rejecting the plan completely, he decided to bring in a third person, Curtis Alfonso Rauer. Curtis, 22 years old, was the drug-addicted brother of Fred's secretary. And when offered $5,000, he didn't hesitate to accept the proposal to kill Sarah. Since neither Eddie nor Fred trusted Curtis to carry out the plan on his own, they agreed that Eddie would go with him, and finally decided that it would happen after Thanksgiving, when Sarah and her children, Rick and Sarah, who was 6, and Mike, who was 4, would return home after spending the holiday with her family in Florida. The three of them returned from the trip on the night of November 29th, 1992. After a long drive, Sarah parked her car in the driveway and got out to open the door, without waking her children, who were still asleep in the back seats. As soon as she opened the door, Curtis Rower lunged at Sarah. He had orders to finish her off inside the house, but to do that, he needed to get Sarah inside, and she didn't make it easy for him. Screaming for help, Sarah tried to run to the car and lock herself inside, but Curtis got in with her and forced her to drive, something she did while repeatedly begging him not to hurt her children. Curtis wasn't moved by Sarah's pleas, and instead ordered her to keep driving for a couple of blocks until they reached the meeting point, where they had agreed Eddie would be waiting for him. He would be waiting with a car to escape. However, when they got to the spot, and he noticed the man wasn't there, he panicked and shot the woman, jumping out of the moving car. With Sarah now fatally wounded, the car kept moving until it came to an abrupt stop in a ditch in front of a church. Ricky, who had seen absolutely everything, hurried to wake up his younger brother, who was still asleep, and quickly got out of the car to head to the church and ask for help. The kids wanted them to call their grandfather. The idea was that he was a doctor, and he could help their mother feel better. At midnight, about 2 hours after the events took place, the victim's husband was finally found at a hotel in downtown Atlanta, where he had traveled for business meeting. After notifying him, the officers contacted Sarah's family in Florida. Sarah's father would later say that Fred got in touch with them right away and that during that first call, he sounded truly shaken. However, the detectives didn't share that feeling. Those who had seen Fred when he received the news thought his reaction was strange. To add to their suspicions, in one of his first statements to the police, Fred seemed to downplay what had happened, saying that Sarah's death was due to a random act of violence. Thanks to the conversations with Chrissy, the police quickly began to suspect the husband's financial activities. So they started monitoring his money movements and his records. That's how, less than 3 weeks after the events, they were able to detect that the lawyer had given Eddie Charles Lawrence $70,000, which the man used to pay a fine and his bail for writing fraudulent checks. Eddie immediately became a person of interest in the investigation, and the police wasted no time in questioning him, although he adamantly denied having anything to do with Sarah's death. However, given his fraud charges, he was held in pretrial detention. While the police were trying to prove that the $70,000 Fred had given Eddie was payment for Sarah's murder, a new lead emerged. Fred's secretary's boyfriend had approached the police to talk and give them the name Curtis Rower. This young man stated that before contacting his brother-in-law, Eddie had offered him $5,000 to kill Sarah. But he refused, and that's why Eddie ended up talking to Curtis. Unlike him, Curtis accepted. It was 2 days before Christmas when the police managed to find Curtis at a relative's house southeast of Atlanta, where he was hiding. That same day, after a 12-hour interrogation, Curtis finally admitted the truth, but said that he had actually killed Sarah by accident. He said that when he didn't see Eddie at the meeting point, he panicked and wanted to get out of the car as quickly as possible, but before he could, the gun went off by accident. This story didn't match Ricky's statement. The boy had to witness his mother being murdered, and described in detail how the bad man suddenly pointed a gun at his mother and shot her before jumping out of the moving car. Don't try to mess with me now. What do you want? I'm not trying to mess with you. I kinda saw. If my dear mother was still awake at that hour, she was definitely as good as dead. And then I woke my brother up and... So, did you really like your brother, Rob? Well, yes, I actually did. I remember telling him very clearly that we absolutely had to go and get some help. And he went to get help. Yeah. But do you remember the first time you made a mistake at home? Like that. You always remember that, don't you? Yeah, I forgot about that, Dad. Yeah, and that's what my mom was like. When he found out his second accomplice had been arrested, Fred decided to disappear. In the middle of the legal battle for custody of his children, he left Mike and Ricky with Sarah's family and fled to Canada, where he stayed in a hotel. After settling into the room, he put a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door and tried to take his own life. However, the Canadian police, who had been alerted about the criminal, found him almost immediately. The man was unconscious but alive, so after receiving medical attention, he was extradited to the United States. Once back in his home country, Fred hired one of the best lawyers, who, in his first statement to the press, tried to defend his client's actions by arguing that he had been under tremendous pressure since his wife's death. According to the lawyer, Fred had felt overwhelmed by Curtis's false accusations, emphasizing that he couldn't believe how the police and authorities would trust a criminal addict like him. Immediately after this statement, Fred began erasing all traces of his activities. He closed his law firm and started liquidating his assets. He even put his family home up for sale, packing his things and throwing away anything he didn't want. By December 31st, Fred had left Atlanta and moved to West Palm Beach with his mother, leaving Mike and Ricky in the care of his late wife's parents, although he visited them at least twice a week. It would be 2 years before the police and authorities could charge Fred with the crimes he had committed. In 1994, he was charged with racketeering, repeatedly laundering money, and planning the murder of his wife. For these initial charges, Fred faced his first trial in 1995. And during that trial, Ricky testified about what he had to witness on the night of the events. His testimony, just like the one he had given years before, was essential for the jury to find his father guilty and for the judge to sentence him to life in prison. However, Fred had not been officially charged with Sarah's death. That only happened in 1997, when, in a new trial, he was sentenced to another life sentence without the possibility of parole. Since he knew he wouldn't be able to get out early for good behavior, he looked for other ways to get that benefit. And he decided to try by becoming an informant. According to what prison authorities would say years later, thanks to his information, the police were able to solve 6 crimes. However, despite his help, he was never able to get his sentence reduced. In May 2020, Fred died in his cell in a Pennsylvania prison due to a neurological illness. As for his accomplices, Eddie has spent decades locked up in a federal prison whose location has not been disclosed. Even though he has no chance of getting out, he got married and in 2008 published a book telling his side of the story. Curtis is also serving a life sentence in a prison in Jackson, Georgia. Sarah and Fred's children went to live with their grandparents in Florida, where they tried to rebuild their lives. And although it seemed like they had managed to do so, sadly, Mike passed away in April 2020, shortly before his father, at the age of 31. The reasons were not made public, and that's how we come to the end of the Talkers family case. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm reading them. Here on the screen are the channel members. Thank you for supporting me through this platform. Just a reminder, channel members get the videos earlier. It could be a day, it could be 2, it all depends on when we finish the video. My nose is pink because I have a cold. Or maybe it's allergies. I don't know, I think it's allergies. So anyway, like I was saying, this is where we wrap up. Here you have a new video, here's a recommended video, you can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.